Peter came and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, if a sister or brother sins against me, how often should I forgive? Up to 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times." Other translations of this story have Jesus answering Peter that he should forgive 70 times 7, which is the version I remember from my growing up years. And like Pastor Leisha, I really liked this 70 by 7 idea because after I did the math, I realized I only had to forgive someone 490 times. Although that still seemed like a lot. Eventually, I came to understand that Jesus is not talking about a specific number, but about an extravagant forgiveness that encourages forgiveness without limits, even beyond the big number of 77 or 490. The problem is that this passage about forgiveness has often been misused. People in domestic violence situations have been coerced into staying with abusive partners. Others have been shamed into not speaking up when they are being mistreated, and this misunderstanding of forgiveness has allowed hurtful people to avoid accountability and consequences. Pastor Carl Jacobson writes that forgiveness does not mean the embrace of violence perpetrated against us. It does not mean giving free rein to those who would do us harm. The misuse of this passage is partly due to the passage being taken out of context. By that I mean we are not interpreting this passage within the context of the entirety of Jesus' teachings. We know that relationships are important to God. After all, how much more relational could God get than when God came to us as a human to be in relationship with us and to show us how to be in relationship with one another? Jesus tells us in Luke that we are to love the Lord our God with all our soul and with all our strength and love our neighbors as ourselves. So what does this relational concept of forgiveness mean? Forgiveness is meant to restore our relationships with one another and with God so that God's people and God's creation may flourish and live in shalom. But I think forgiveness is actually a process that includes various actions and resources rather than a one-time, one-sided decision. I call this process the economy of forgiveness. This economy of forgiveness includes truth-telling and accountability. We participate in this economy in our worship together when we have confession before we have absolution and forgiveness. Accountability requires us to be courageously truthful to one another and to ourselves. It includes taking responsibility for the hurt that has been caused. It includes understanding how the offense has affected other people, and in many cases, multiple other people, and even the offender. In the economy of forgiveness, there's an expectation that the offense will not be repeated. There's an opportunity for healing. Healing for the one who was wronged, healing for the one who perpetrated the wrong, and healing for the community at large. Along with this healing comes the potential for restoration of relationship, of wholeness, of hope. Without these elements in our economy of forgiveness, forgiveness becomes like cheap grace. Theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer described cheap grace as the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church oversight, communion without confession, and absolution without personal confession. He says further that costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for at the door at which a person must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, but it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. So cheap forgiveness is forgiveness without accountability, forgiveness without repentance, forgiveness without the expectation of change. Costly forgiveness is forgiveness with requirements, not because it isn't freely given, but because it urges transformation and restoration. But what do we do when the other party will not participate in this economy of forgiveness? What if the other person just keeps offending against us, expecting that we will give in to cheap forgiveness and they can go on to cause harm while we simply suffer and lick our wounds. How do we lovingly hold people accountable when they refuse that accountability? What does forgiveness look like when it's impossible? Therein lies the struggle. And I don't have a simple or direct answer to this question. However, this very struggle is holy ground. God is right in the midst of it with us. God sees us wrestling, sees our courage when we take our faltering steps of calling another to account, regardless of whether the other takes responsibility. God honors the struggle, wrestles alongside us, and calls us to repentance. And God reminds us again and again that God's intention for restoration and healing, God's intention is for a restoration and healing which will ultimately have the last word for all of us. Amen.